This morning's reading is from Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 to 21. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judea, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and he put in the treasures house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from the Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and the wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat in the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they would drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set up by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the enchanters in this whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
Well, good morning. My name is Scott, one of the ministers, and we're picking up a little series I began 2 weeks ago, and then we had a bit of a kind of interruption to it, a good interruption to it. We're looking at the idea of exile to homecoming, a brief overview of the Old Testament books which describe the story of Israel in the few centuries before Jesus, their exile, their deportation or kind of capture from Babylon into the time of Christ. So 2 weeks ago we looked at Jeremiah. You remember all that, don't you? And Jeremiah's big message was there is trouble coming. Does anyone remember from where the trouble was coming? The north, always the north in the prophets. The trouble is coming from the north. And today this trouble arrives in the form of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And so look at verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes to Jerusalem and besieges it. Now there were actually a few sieges of Jerusalem, and sometimes the kings kind of gave into it and became a vassal state. You know what that is? A kind of servant state of the Babylonian Empire, and then they rebelled again. Well, if you read the end of 2 Kings, there was a final siege. It went for something like 18 months, perhaps up to 30 months, depending on who you ask. It went for a long time, and it completely destroyed the city. And whereas the false prophets that Jeremiah spoke about of peace were prophesying that Jerusalem would never fall, it indeed did fall. We have the temple, they said. God would never let this happen. But indeed it did happen. In fact, look at verse 2. Now, you might need to look in your new sheets. I've got some slides, but not all. Verse 2. And the Lord... So see who did this. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God, and these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia. Now, this is what ancient civilizations did. Their foreign policy was such that the conquering victor took the cream of the crop, almost all of the population, and deported them to the kingdom of Babylon. That would kind of slow down any rebellion that might occur in the Judean landscape. And not only did they do that, they took the holy items of Israel and stuck them in their own temples. And that was a way of saying, my God is better than your God, or my gods, I should say, for Babylon, is better than your God. You know, we've got your stuff and we've stuck it in our temple. Our nation, our God is better. But it's the Lord who delivered them, verse 2. This is not the abandonment by God of his people, the author of Daniel wants you to know, but this is God's deliverance of them through natural consequences of their choices. God is like a parent. Now, here we are on Mother's Day, and what do mothers and fathers need to sometimes do with their children? They need to let them wear the natural consequences of their choices. Your children will do things you do not want them to do. Very few of them, I'm sure, but some will. And the more children you have, I'm just letting you know from experience, the more opportunity they might have to do things which you think they ought not to do. In your great wisdom, of course. And sometimes you need to let them go, yeah? You need to let them make their own choices. You need to let them bear the consequences of their own choices. And they will come home when they've learnt their lesson, when they're willing. And this is the story of the Old Testament. It's the natural consequences of God's children being born out as they wear the choices they make, and at a time come home. This is the idea of the series, right? Now, the city was completely destroyed, and the Judean population, as I said, was deported, carried away for the most part. But this is what happened. Have a look at verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. And what happens is, in this rest of this story, is that we're told that the cream of the crop are chosen to serve in public office for the enemy, for the Babylonians. And they received the best that Babylon could offer. The best language, the best worldview training, the best education at the universities of the day, and the best food and wine. Did you notice? Now, we're introduced to them in verse 6. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the key, and I think, Leanne, we can probably go to my slides now. The key is verse 7. For it says in verse 7, the chief official gave them new names. Now let me just tell you what their names mean. So Daniel means God is my judge. My son Daniel reminds me of this often. Hananiah, Yahweh, when you see the Lord capitalised in your Bibles in the Old Testament, it's translating Yahweh, the holy name of God. Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah, Yahweh has helped. And each of these men are now addressed no longer according to their identity given to them by their families, by their culture and by their religion. See, what do you do as mothers when you have a child? What did your mother do for you as a child? And fathers, if you're lucky, you might get involved too. Is you name, don't you? It's a profound act of ownership, belonging, and identity. And here they're losing what their mothers had given them. They're losing their relationship with their culture and their ethnicity. And the Babylonian Empire is trying to give them a new identity to the gods of Babylon. Probably, the scholars say, that the new names given to them reflected religious names in the Babylonian Empire. This is nothing short than a story about identity and conversion to a new worldview. This is faith lived in exile. This is how to worship God as a minority in a hostile culture. And the lesson that we learn is that Daniel and his friends, and really they're just a type or a kind of inspirational ideal for every Israelite, are called to live out their faith through both saying no and saying yes. Firstly, let's look at the no. In verse 8, we read that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now, we're not told what it is about the food and the wine which is defiling, which is compromising. This defilement word is a religious ritual word in Jewish culture. This will compromise, we might use that word, compromise my relationship with God. We're not told what it is. Perhaps the experts tell us it's one of two things. Perhaps that food, which kind of looks like it's meat because they get veggies, food and wine are sacrificed to the Babylonian gods. And so there's a sense of religious defilement. Or perhaps they're not prepared according to the kosher laws of Judaism. That is the way that the animals are slaughtered and so forth. Although it's the wine as well. You can see why they're not quite sure. But one commentator I read pointed out that it's good that we don't know why. Because imagine if you're a Jew reading this in exile, you'll always be searching for the law. That kind of line in the sand which you're not allowed to or you are allowed to follow. In fact, that's what we would do. We would say, oh, well, the defilement was some law that Daniel didn't feel comfortable breaking. But what that commentator pointed out is the fact that we don't know means it's a timeless story. It's your story. And it's my story. We're invited to think through, with the wisdom of Solomon, perhaps, or the wisdom of Daniel, about what it is that might be defiling to us in our Babylonian story, in our exile, in our calling in this passage to live out an authentic relationship with God in a culture, which perhaps isn't hostile, but which is complicated, is it not? You can insert yourself. The commentator wrote this. I love the way he wrote this. Have a listen. The lads of Judah said no to the menu at the high table. The food was fit for a king, but in Daniel's judgment, it was not fit for a servant of the King of Kings. And so what is it on the menu of our culture that you need to say no to? Babylon was a religious place and sought to convert them to a religious worldview, perhaps not so with ours. But our culture is not neutral. It's actually quite forceful. It has a creed. It has a set of beliefs about who you are and how you should think and what you should live for. Brendan and Melissa were here on Sunday evening and they were talking about the religion of secularism and how we find meaning. And they pointed out that the purpose of life in secularism, which is our dominant worldview, is to minimise pain and to maximise pleasure. There you go, there's a creed for you. And we live in this culture of the radical self, where I find my meaning, I find who I am, not by reference to anybody else, not by reference to even my family identity, not cultural identity, certainly not a religious identity. Those things are considered oppressive to my true self, which is within, which I will discover and I will define for myself. It's called, philosophically, self-actualization, if you want to go look it up. And yet the very claim of Christianity is that my trust is not in myself, that myself is frail and not trustworthy completely. And I find my truest self through an external person called Jesus Christ. And there is something that is wrong with me that Jesus puts right in me and with others and with my Lord and my Creator. Do you see how radical that is in Babylon? And so we will find ourselves, like Daniel, needing to say no. We'll be at odds. But there are some people who are always trying to say no to everything. Some people have a disposition to finding fault with everything in culture. That there is no good and therefore we need to withdraw from it. And there's been Christian movements throughout Christian history which have sought to withdraw from culture. It's too bad, it's too defiling for me, yeah? Or you might say it's too defiling, therefore I need to take the culture over. I need to make it undefiled culture. And so that's the worst expression might be Christian nationalism. And so if you're someone who's always tempted to say no, you need to see here that Daniel said yes to lots of things, didn't he? He was able to live out his authentic faith by going to the best of the Babylonian universities, by being trained to serve the enemy of God's people, taking on their language, even being addressed by a foreign name with foreign connotations, with a foreign God. In other words, he could live a true faith even though he wasn't in Jerusalem, he didn't have the temple, he didn't have the priesthood, all the laws weren't being followed, and he didn't have his community of faith. Which means Daniel's story and your story and my story, the biblical story, is that we can live rightly without God in the midst of less than ideal circumstances. We can say yes to lots of things. Now, I don't envy you because I live in a sheltered world. I said that at 8 o'clock service and I was wearing a white dress when I said it, you see. I live in a sheltered world. I live in the church world. You live in the real world. You live and teach and work and participate in the educational institutions of our culture, at the healthcare, in the healthcare systems, in the legal systems, government, welfare, business, community, groups, industry. And all those are complicated contexts in which your true identity will be challenged at various points, where the menu that will be offered to you will be interesting, that require you to say lots of yeses, but occasionally a big no. And you will need the wisdom of Solomon, Daniel. You'll need the prayers of your faith community. You'll need to be a theologian in situ. Because I don't know your industry enough to tell you how that all works out. We have to work together on this. Life is very specialised nowadays and very complicated. And you're going to have to figure out how to live your authentic faith towards Yahweh, your God, in a way where you'll sometimes say no. 1 Peter 3:15 is a text that will appear on the screen. Yes, here it is, see? This is a hostile culture, the Apostle Peter writing. Even if you should suffer, right? You're suffering. Do not fear their threats. Think about Jesus' words. Don't fear those who can kill body, but cannot kill the soul. But in your hearts, revere, or I like the old version. Do you remember that one? Set apart. Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. This is a wonderful picture, not of taking over culture, not of withdrawing from culture, but from just being ready, like Daniel, to sometimes say a no, to have Christ set apart, and to be prepared to give an answer. Now, when you say no, sometimes things will go very well. So the rest of this passage is about how well it went for Daniel. Did you notice that? The guy says, look, I don't really like this idea. If you're on veggies, they're on meat. You're not going to look as good. I'll get in trouble. The whole thing will collapse. But as you read on, you find out Daniel says, look, let's give this a go for 10 days or whatever he says. And things turn out really well for him. He looks better. He gets better kind of ability to interpret dreams and visions, and he gets used in high office in the Babylon. Everything went really well. So when you say no, sometimes things might go well. But if you read the Bible, you'll realise that things don't always go well. Just read Hebrews 11 one day, which takes you through all the heroes of the faith. And the fact that most of them end up dead for their no's tell you that look, things had to go well in chapter 1 for Daniel, or you wouldn't have got chapter 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. The story had to go well, but it doesn't always. In fact, there's a lovely passage in Daniel chapter 3. Lovely, perhaps is not the right word, where they're called to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's idol image. And they reply to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to talk to you about this. You've threatened us with the blazing furnace. Look, put us in it. The God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will. But have a look at the next line. But even if he does not, it'll come up, yeah. Even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods. We will not worship the image of gold you have set up. And he ordered the furnace to be heated up hotter, right? In other words, the story of Daniel is even if things don't turn out right, we still will not compromise. We will still need to say no sometimes. Now, why are these stories present in the Bible? Because God is trying to inspire faithfulness, courage, wisdom, and a relationship with God in less than ideal circumstances. And you won't always be rewarded for your no. In fact, the chances are you won't be rewarded for your no. But this is a good thing. Because I would hate for you to leave this morning and to just get from this message that you need to be more faithful. Why? Because really, do we want our Christian lives to be dependent upon our faithfulness? If God rewarded me according to my faithfulness, if God rewarded you according to your faithfulness, your courage, what should your reward be? We don't even know when to say yes and when to say no, do we? And if we knew, we'd probably just choose to minimise pain and maximise pleasure. Serve the gods of comfort, power and control, which are the same gods that the Babylonian Empire served. They just did it through idol images. We do it through our bank accounts. We do it through our comfortable lifestyles. We do it through controlling our circumstances. We need somebody else. Their faithfulness, not ours. We need a Daniel to lead the way. We need to live our lives in Daniel and through Daniel. Daniel is a figure to inspire, but also to live through for the Old Testament people. And here's the thing. Jesus Christ is the perfect Daniel. He's the one who endures the furnace, who endures the fire, who faces the lion. We've had a bit of a lion theme, haven't we? Who says no, not just to Satan, but no to his own will. Not my will, but yours be done. You see that? He is the one who has a level of faithfulness which we never have had and never could have. And the book of Daniel invites us not just to live with courage for Christ, knowing that God will ultimately vindicate and reward us, but it points to a Daniel figure in whose name is our true reward and whose courage and faithfulness is the way in which we will ultimately be vindicated. Because it's only Jesus who fulfills God's will perfectly. And it's therefore only Jesus who can actually represent us to God. It's only Jesus who can bring us home from exile. After we've learned our lesson and we're ready to say sorry, after we've borne the consequences of our foolishness and our hard hearts, it's only Jesus who opens the gate and allows us to come home, who dies and who is resurrected, defeating death itself. And he faces all that because God is the perfect parent. And Jesus is our brother, or a brother-like figure, I think the book of Hebrews says. And they are committed to bringing you home. Is it time to come home? To end the exile? To have learnt our lesson? And to come into the Father's love. There's this beautiful text from Hebrews which says, therefore, holy brothers and sisters, the church of God, fix your thoughts on Jesus, not on your faithfulness, not on your kind of courage and your inspirations, but fix it upon Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, that's God. That's what the book, or all the books of the Old Testament are pointing towards, the faithfulness of Jesus. In him you have your way home. In him you have a relationship with God. I'm going to say a prayer for us, which is a very ancient prayer from a bloke called Anselm. With a name like that, you have to be ancient. It's not on the screen, but it's from our prayer books. And I think it combines this theme of how good Jesus is, how faithful he is, how Daniel-like he is, how he transcends Daniel and is our faithful friend and brother. And it also combines some Mother's Day themes in it. So let me pray this. Jesus, as a mother, you gather your people to you. You are gentle with us as a mother with her children. Often you weep over our sins and our pride. Tenderly you draw us from hatred and judgment. You comfort us in sorrow and bind up our wounds. In sickness you nurse us, and with pure milk you feed us. Jesus, by your dying we are born to new life. By your anguish and labour we come forth in joy. Despair turns to hope through your sweet goodness, through your gentleness we find comfort in fear. Your warmth gives life to the dead. Your touch makes sinners righteous. Lord Jesus, in your mercy heal us. In your love and tenderness remake us. In your compassion bring grace and forgiveness. For the beauty of heaven, may your love prepare us. Amen.